Marcus Sterling stood at the window of his penthouse office, watching the Manhattan skyline shimmer in the late afternoon sun. At 32, he had everything most people spent their lives chasing: a billion-dollar tech consulting empire, a fleet of luxury cars, and a reputation as one of New York's most eligible bachelors. But today, none of that mattered. His perfectly ordered world was about to be turned upside down by a promise made decades ago. "You can't be serious," Marcus said, not turning to face his father who sat behind him. His voice was steady, but his fingers gripped the crystal tumbler of scotch so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Richard Sterling, his silver hair immaculate as always, didn't flinch at his son's cold tone. "I've never been more serious. The agreement was made when you were children. William Parker saved this family's company during the crash of '08. Without his investment and support, Sterling Technologies wouldn't exist today." Marcus finally turned, his dark eyes blazing. "That was 15 years ago. You're telling me that because William Parker helped us then, I'm supposed to marry his daughter now? This isn't the 1800s, Dad. People don't arrange marriages anymore. This isn't just about repaying a debt." Richard leaned forward, his expression grave. "The Parker Group is planning to expand into tech consulting. They could become our biggest competitor or our strongest ally. This marriage would cement our partnership and double our market share overnight." Marcus drained his scotch, welcoming the burn. "And what about what I want? What about love?" Richard's laugh was sharp and without humor. "Love? Since when do you believe in love, Marcus? How many women have you dated in the last year alone? You treat relationships like business transactions anyway. At least this one would have some real benefits." The words stung because they held a grain of truth. Marcus had always approached relationships strategically, never letting anyone get too close. But this was different. This felt like a cage closing around him. "What about Emma Parker? Doesn't she get a say in this?" "She's already agreed." Richard's smile was triumphant. "William spoke with her last week. She understands the advantages this union would bring to both families." Marcus remembered Emma Parker vaguely from charity events and social gatherings over the years. She was pretty in a quiet way, with honey blonde hair and green eyes that seemed to see too much. But she'd always struck him as painfully proper and traditional, content to work in her father's shadow at the Parker Group instead of making her own mark on the world. "She's not exactly my type," Marcus said, pouring himself another drink. "She lacks ambition." "You don't know her at all," Richard countered. "When was the last time you actually had a conversation with her? People can surprise you, son." Before Marcus could respond, his assistant's voice came through the intercom. "Mr. Sterling, Emma Parker is here for your 2 o'clock meeting." Marcus shot his father an accusatory look. "You arranged this?" Richard stood, straightening his tie. "Of course I did. You're both adults. The least you can do is discuss this civilly." He headed for the door, pausing with his hand on the handle. "1 year, Marcus. That's all we're asking. Give the marriage 1 year. If you're both miserable after that, you can divorce quietly and we'll find another way to handle the merger." After his father left, Marcus walked to his desk, trying to calm the anger churning in his gut. He was used to being in control, to making his own choices. The idea of being forced into marriage made him feel like a puppet dancing on his father's strings. When Emma Parker walked in, Marcus had to admit his memory hadn't done her justice. She wore a tailored charcoal suit that highlighted her slim figure, her blonde hair swept into an elegant chignon. But it was her eyes that caught him off guard, sharp and calculating, with none of the demure shyness he remembered. "Hello, Marcus," she said, her voice cool and professional. "I assume your father has filled you in on the situation?" He gestured for her to sit, studying her carefully. "He has, and I have to say, I'm surprised you agreed to this archaic arrangement so easily." Emma's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Who says I agreed easily? I simply weighed the pros and cons and made a strategic decision." "Isn't that what you would do?" Her words echoed his usual approach to life so closely that Marcus felt oddly unsettled. And what pros could possibly outweigh being forced into a loveless marriage? Access to Sterling Technologies' resources and connections, she answered without hesitation. A seat on the board of the merged company. The chance to implement some of my ideas on a much larger scale. She leaned forward slightly. I've been developing plans to revolutionize how we approach tech consulting, but my father's company is too traditional to take the risks. Your company has the infrastructure and reputation I need. Marcus found himself intrigued despite his resistance. This wasn't the passive, traditional woman he'd expected. So you're using this marriage to advance your own agenda? Aren't you using it to protect yours? She raised an eyebrow. We're both ambitious people, Marcus. We both understand that sometimes personal sacrifice is necessary for professional gain. 1 year of marriage in exchange for expanding our business empires seems like a reasonable trade. Don't you think? He studied her for a long moment. And what happens if one of us falls in love with someone else during this year? Then we handle it discreetly, Emma replied. This is a business arrangement, nothing more. I'm not looking for love, and from what I've heard, neither are you. Marcus couldn't help but admire her pragmatic approach, even as something in him rebelled against the whole idea. You make it sound so simple. It can be, she said, standing smoothly. If we both remember that this is just another business deal. She pulled a folder from her briefcase and placed it on his desk. These are my conditions for the marriage. Review them and have your lawyers contact mine if you have any concerns. We should aim to have everything finalized within a month. As she turned to leave, Marcus called after her. Most women would at least pretend to be marrying for love. Emma paused at the door, looking back at him with those unervingly perceptive eyes. I'm not most women, Marcus. The sooner you understand that, the easier this year will be for both of us. After she left, Marcus sat at his desk for a long time, staring at the folder she'd left behind. He'd expected to feel trapped, angry at being forced into this arrangement. Instead, he felt something he hadn't expected, curiosity. Emma Parker was clearly not the woman he'd assumed she was. The question was, would that make their impending marriage easier or infinitely more complicated? Opening the folder, he began to read her conditions, a reluctant smile tugging at his lips. One thing was certain, the next year was going to be anything but boring. The wedding was a lavish affair that made the society pages swoon, but for Marcus Sterling, it felt like an elaborate business presentation. He stood at the altar of St. Patrick's Cathedral, surrounded by 1,000 of New York's elite, watching his bride approach with the same analytical eye he used to evaluate potential acquisitions. Emma was stunning in a sleek Vera Wang gown, but it was her composure that caught his attention. No blushing bride here. She walked down the aisle with the confidence of a CEO entering a boardroom, her smile perfectly calibrated for the cameras. When she reached him, her hand was cool and steady in his. "Ready to seal the deal?" she whispered, just before the priest began the ceremony. Marcus almost laughed at her choice of words. "Always closing, aren't you?" The reception at the plaza was equally orchestrated, a celebration of power and wealth rather than love. Marcus watched as Emma worked the room with practiced ease, charming potential investors and making connections that could benefit their future ventures. She was good, better than good. He found himself studying her technique, the way she mixed just enough warmth with her professional demeanor to make people feel special without crossing any lines. It wasn't until they reached the penthouse that would be their shared home that the facade cracked slightly. Emma kicked off her heels the moment they entered, letting out a small sigh of relief that was the most genuine sound he'd heard from her all day. "Home sweet home," Marcus said dryly, loosening his bow tie. "Should we discuss sleeping arrangements?" Emma was already heading toward one of the guest rooms, carrying a small overnight bag. "I've had my things moved into the blue room down the hall. I assume you'll keep the master suite. You don't want to maintain appearances by sharing a room?" He wasn't sure why he asked. It wasn't like he wanted to share his personal space with her. She turned, giving him a measured look. "The staff are all bound by NDAs, and we've already agreed this is a business arrangement. Unless you're planning to give tours of our bedroom, separate rooms make more sense." "Always practical," he murmured. "Always," she agreed, but there was something in her tone that made him look closer. For just a moment, he caught a glimpse of something like loneliness in her eyes before her professional mask slipped back into place. "Good night, Marcus. I have an early meeting tomorrow." Over the next few weeks, they settled into an oddly comfortable routine. They were rarely home at the same time, both throwing themselves into work with an intensity that would have destroyed a real marriage. When their paths did cross, it was usually over coffee in the morning, where they would discuss business strategies and upcoming social obligations with the efficiency of longtime colleagues. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to shift. Marcus found himself intrigued by the notes she left scattered around her home office, brilliant analyses of market trends and innovative proposals for restructuring traditional consulting models. Her mind worked differently than his, seeing connections he missed and approaching problems from angles he'd never considered. One night, he found her still working at midnight, surrounded by papers and looking more disheveled than he'd ever seen her. Her hair had escaped its usual perfect arrangement, and she traded her designer suits for yoga pants and an oversized Harvard Business School sweatshirt. "Do you ever stop?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. "Do you?" she countered without looking up. "Fair point." He moved into the room, picking up one of her diagrams. "This is interesting, integrating AI predictive analytics with human consulting teams. But the initial investment would be massive. That's why I needed Sterling Technologies' resources," she said, finally meeting his eyes. "The Parker Group is too conservative. They still think AI is a passing trend." Marcus sat down across from her, genuinely curious now. "Is that the real reason you agreed to this marriage? To get your hands on our R&D budget?" "Partly," she admitted. "But there's more to it." She hesitated, then seemed to come to a decision. "What do you know about the Parker Group's financial situation?" The question caught him off guard. "Your father's company? It's rock solid, one of the most stable firms on Wall Street." Emma's laugh was bitter. "That's what everyone thinks. That's what my father wants everyone to think. But we're bleeding money, Marcus. Bad investments, mismanagement, and my father's refusal to adapt to changing markets. We're 6 months away from collapse." Marcus felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. If the Parker Group went under, it would send shockwaves through the financial sector. "Does my father know?" "No one knows except me and a few top executives. I've been trying to turn things around for the past 2 years. But my father won't listen. He still treats me like his little girl playing at business." Her voice cracked slightly, showing the first real emotion he'd seen from her. "This merger isn't just about expansion. It's about survival. I need to save my father's legacy, even if he's too proud to admit it needs saving." Marcus stared at her, seeing her in a completely new light. All this time, he'd thought she was just another privileged heiress looking to advance her career. But she'd been fighting a silent battle, carrying a burden he couldn't imagine. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked quietly. "Because I'm tired of pretending," she said, running a hand through her messy hair. "And because I need your help, not just your company's resources, your expertise. You built Sterling Technologies into a powerhouse by taking smart risks and embracing innovation. That's what the Parker Group needs." "And what do I get out of this?" The words came automatically, the businessman in him always looking for the advantage. Emma met his gaze steadily. "Besides preventing a market crash that could damage Sterling Technologies too, you get a partner who understands exactly how lonely it is at the top. Someone who knows what it's like to sacrifice everything for success." The air between them felt charged suddenly, heavy with understanding and something else, something that felt dangerously like attraction. Marcus found himself noticing the curve of her neck, the intensity in her green eyes, the way her usual polish had been stripped away to reveal something raw and real. "Partners," he said slowly, testing the word. "That wasn't part of our original agreement." "Plans change," she replied softly. "People change." Before he could respond, his phone buzzed with an urgent message. Looking down, he felt his blood run cold. Someone had leaked information about the Parker Group's financial troubles to the press. The story would break in tomorrow's Wall Street Journal. When he looked up, Emma was already reading the same message on her own phone. The color had drained from her face, and for the first time since he'd known her, She looked truly afraid. "Marcus," she whispered, "everything I've worked for. It's all going to fall apart." He moved without thinking, crossing the room to kneel beside her chair. "No, it's not. We'll figure this out together." She looked at him with desperate hope. "Why would you help me? This isn't part of our deal." "Maybe I'm tired of deals," he said, surprising himself with his honesty. "Maybe it's time we both stop treating everything like a business transaction." The moment hung between them, fragile and charged with possibility. Then Emma's phone rang, her father's name flashing on the screen, and reality came crashing back in. They had less than 12 hours before the story broke. Less than 12 hours to save not just the Parker Group, but everything both of their families had built. And somewhere in the back of Marcus's mind, a small voice whispered that he was no longer doing this just for business. The way his heart raced when Emma looked at him, the need to protect her that he'd never felt for anyone else, this was becoming dangerously personal. The next 12 hours were a blur of emergency meetings, frantic phone calls, and desperate strategizing. Marcus watched Emma transform from the vulnerable woman he'd spoken with in their penthouse into a force of nature, her voice never wavering as she faced down the board members of both companies in an emergency session. "Gentlemen," she said, standing at the head of the conference table at 4 a.m., her suit as pristine as if it were the middle of the afternoon. "The story about our financial situation is going to break in 3 hours. We can either let it destroy us, or we can control the narrative and turn this into an opportunity." William Parker, Emma's father, sat slumped in his chair, looking every bit his 65 years. "An opportunity? Emma, this is a disaster. Our stock will plummet the moment the market opens." "Not if we announce the merger first," Marcus interjected, stepping up beside Emma. The move wasn't planned, but it felt natural to stand with her. "We release a statement at 6 a.m. announcing that Sterling Technologies and the Parker Group are merging to create the largest consulting firm in the country. We frame the Parker Group's financial issues as growing pains from aggressive expansion plans." Emma shot him a grateful look before continuing. "The merger was always the plan. We're just accelerating the timeline. With Sterling Technologies backing, our stock might take a hit, but it won't crash. We can weather this." Richard Sterling leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "This isn't what we agreed to. The merger was supposed to happen gradually, over the course of your first year of marriage. We're not prepared for an immediate consolidation." "Then we'd better get prepared," Marcus said firmly, "because this is happening. I'm calling in every favor, every connection I have." Emma's right. This is our only play. The next few hours were a masterclass in crisis management. Marcus watched in amazement as Emma orchestrated everything, coordinating with PR teams, lawyers, and financial advisors. She seemed to be everywhere at once, her mind working 3 steps ahead of everyone else. At 5:45 a.m., just before the press release was scheduled to go out, Marcus found her alone in his office, staring out at the pre-dawn city. She looked exhausted but undefeated. "Thank you," she said without turning around. "You didn't have to back me up in there. You could have walked away from this mess." Marcus moved to stand beside her. "Is that what you expected me to do?" "It's what most people would do. Cut their losses, protect their own interests." She finally looked at him, her green eyes troubled. "Why didn't you?" Before he could answer, his phone buzzed. The press release had gone out. Within minutes, their phones were lighting up with notifications as the news began to spread. They stood together in silence, watching the first reactions roll in. The initial response was chaos. The Wall Street Journal's story about the Parker Group's troubles hit like a bomb, but their merger announcement provided a counter-narrative that the media latched onto. By the time the market opened, their stock was volatile but not catastrophic. Hours passed in a whirlwind of damage control. It wasn't until late that evening that they finally returned to their penthouse, both too wired to sleep despite their exhaustion. "Drink?" Marcus offered, heading for the bar. "God, yes," Emma replied, collapsing onto the sofa and kicking off her heels. "Make it strong." He poured them both a generous measure of scotch and sat beside her, closer than he normally would. "You were incredible today. I've never seen anyone handle a crisis like that. I've had practice, she said quietly, taking a long sip. I've been handling crises at the Parker Group since I was 25. My father. He's a brilliant man, but he never adapted to the modern business world. He still thinks relationships and handshake deals are enough. Is that why you kept the problems hidden from him for so long? Emma's fingers tightened around her glass. I was trying to protect him. He built that company from nothing, gave me every advantage in life. How could I tell him he was destroying his own legacy? You can't protect everyone, Emma, Marcus said gently. Says the man who just risked his own company to save mine. She turned to face him, their knees touching. Seriously, Marcus, why did you do it? This could have been your chance to back out of our arrangement. Take over the Parker Group for pennies on the dollar in a few months. Marcus set his drink down, suddenly needing his hands free. Maybe I'm tired of thinking about everything in terms of profit and loss. Maybe seeing you fight so hard for your father's company reminded me of why I got into business in the first place. To build something meaningful, not just to make money. And maybe, he continued, reaching out to brush a strand of hair from her face, I'm starting to think this arrangement of ours isn't as simple as we pretended it would be. Emma's breath caught at his touch. Marcus, tell me you don't feel it too, he said softly. This connection between us. It's not just business anymore, is it? Before she could answer, her phone rang, her father's ringtone. Emma closed her eyes for a moment, visibly gathering herself. When she opened them, her walls were back up. I have to take this, she said, standing quickly. He's not handling today well. Marcus watched her walk away, frustration coursing through him. They'd been so close to something real, something that went beyond their carefully negotiated arrangement. But Emma's sense of duty to her father was like a wall between them, and he wasn't sure if he had the right to try to break it down. What he didn't know was that Emma had her own walls, built not just from duty but from years of disappointment and betrayal. And as she spoke softly to her father in the next room, trying to reassure him that everything would be okay, she was fighting her own battle, between the heart she'd locked away years ago and the feelings for Marcus that were becoming harder to deny. The merger announcement had saved them from immediate disaster, but the real test was just beginning. They would have to navigate not just the complexities of combining two massive companies, but also the growing tension between them, a tension that threatened to either destroy their careful arrangement or transform it into something neither of them had expected to find. The weeks following the merger announcement were a crucible that tested both Marcus and Emma in ways neither had expected. While the business world buzzed with speculation about their sudden consolidation, they found themselves walking a delicate line between professional partnership and the undeniable tension growing between them. The merger task force had taken over the entire 47th floor of Sterling Technologies headquarters. Emma spent her days in marathon meetings, coordinating the integration of two massive corporate cultures while trying to maintain the appearance of stability for nervous investors. Marcus watched her with growing admiration and concern. She worked longer hours than anyone, surviving on coffee and sheer determination, her face growing more drawn with each passing day. One evening, he found her alone in the conference room, surrounded by financial projections and integration timelines. The sun had set hours ago, and the city lights sparkled beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. When was the last time you ate? He asked, setting down a container of soup from her favorite deli. Emma looked up, blinking as if emerging from a trance. What time is it? Almost 10. He sat down beside her, close enough to smell her perfume, something light and expensive that had become distractingly familiar. The numbers will still be here tomorrow. The quarterly projections are due to the board on Monday. If we don't show strong integration progress, the stock will drop, investors will panic, and everything we've worked for will fall apart, he finished. I know the speech, Emma. I've heard you practice it in your sleep. She stared at him, startled. What? You talk in your sleep when you fall asleep on the couch, he explained, pushing the soup closer. Which has happened 3 times this week alone. A faint blush colored her cheeks. I didn't realize you'd noticed. I notice everything about you, he said quietly. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Emma's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the soup, and Marcus fought the urge to capture them in his own. "We should focus on the merger," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "The merger is proceeding exactly as planned. Both teams are working well together, the market has stabilized, and our joint projects are ahead of schedule." He leaned back, studying her profile. "What's really keeping you here so late?" Emma was silent for a long moment, stirring the soup absently. "My father resigned from the board today." Marcus sat up straighter. "What? Why wasn't I informed?" "Because I asked him to keep it quiet until I could figure out how to handle the announcement." She set the soup aside, untouched. "He said he's stepping aside to let the next generation lead. But really, he can't bear to watch his company being absorbed into Sterling Technologies. Every decision we make, every Parker Group policy we change. It's like I'm erasing him bit by bit." "You're saving his legacy," Marcus insisted. "Without this merger dash, I know, the company would have collapsed." Emma stood abruptly, pacing to the window. "But you don't understand what it's like. Every morning at breakfast, he reads the business news like he's attending his own funeral. He barely speaks to me anymore. I think he blames me for all of it." Marcus followed her to the window, his heart aching at the pain in her voice. "Emma, you've done everything possible to protect him. At some point, you have to live your own life." She turned to face him, and he was stunned to see tears in her eyes. "Have I lived my own life? Everything I've done has been about the company, about my father's legacy. Even this marriage. Is that all this is to you?" he asked, stepping closer. "Just another sacrifice for the company?" Emma's breath hitched. "Marcus, please. We agreed this was just business. Did we? Because I'm starting to think we were both lying to ourselves." He reached up, cupping her face gently. "Tell me you don't feel this too." For a moment, she leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed. Then her phone buzzed, another message from her father, and she pulled away as if burned. "I can't," she whispered. "There's too much at stake. The merger, the companies, my father." "What about what you want?" Marcus demanded, frustration coloring his voice. "When was the last time you made a decision just for yourself?" "I don't have that luxury," she said, but he could see the conflict in her eyes. "It's not a luxury, Emma. It's called living." He moved closer again, backing her against the window. "Tell me you want me to walk away. Tell me you feel nothing, and I'll go back to treating this like the business arrangement we claimed it would be." Emma's hands came up to rest against his chest, but she didn't push him away. "I can't," she repeated, but this time the words held a different meaning. Marcus leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to stop him. When his lips finally met hers, the kiss was gentle at first, a question more than a demand. But then Emma made a small sound in the back of her throat, her fingers curling into his shirt, and the last threads of his control snapped. He kissed her like a drowning man finding air, pouring weeks of longing and frustration into the contact. Emma matched his intensity, her usual composure shattering as she pulled him closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Marcus rested his forehead against hers. "Tell me this isn't real," he challenged softly. "Tell me it's just business." Before Emma could respond, the conference room door opened. They sprang apart, but not quickly enough to hide what had happened from William Parker, who stood frozen in the doorway. The look of betrayal on his face stopped Emma cold. "Daddy, is this what it was all about?" William's voice was thick with disgust. "Seducing Sterling's son to take over my company?" "Mr. Parker," Marcus started, but William cut him off with a raised hand. "I thought you were different, Emma. I thought you were trying to save our company. But you're just like all the rest, willing to do anything, use anyone to get power." He turned away, his shoulders slumped. "I guess I didn't know you at all." "Dad, wait." Emma moved to follow him, but Marcus caught her arm. "Let me talk to him," he said. "You're too close to this." She shook her head, tears flowing freely now. "You don't understand. He's all I have left. After my mother died, we only had each other. I can't lose him too." "You haven't lost anyone," Marcus insisted. "But you need to start fighting for what you want." not just what you think you owe him. Emma pulled away from him, wrapping her arms around herself. What I want doesn't matter. It never has. It matters to me, Marcus said quietly. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and he could see the war raging behind her eyes, duty versus desire, obligation versus possibility. I need time, she finally said, to figure out who I am without all of this. Without trying to be what everyone else needs me to be. Marcus nodded slowly, even as his heart rebelled against letting her go. Take all the time you need. But Emma, he waited until she met his eyes again. Don't run away from this, from us. Just because it wasn't part of the plan. She gave him a sad smile. Plans change. Remember? People change too, he reminded her. Emma gathered her things with trembling hands and walked to the door. She paused there, looking back at him with an expression that made his chest ache. Maybe that's what I'm afraid of. After she left, Marcus stood at the window for a long time, watching the city lights blur through eyes that burned with unexpected emotion. He'd entered this marriage thinking it was just another business deal, but somewhere along the way, Emma Parker had breached all his carefully constructed defenses. Now he had to decide if he was willing to fight for her, not as a business partner or an arranged wife, but as the woman he was falling in love with. And somewhere in the city, Emma faced her own choice. Continue being the dutiful daughter who sacrificed everything for her father's legacy, or become the woman who dared to choose her own happiness. The merger that was supposed to be their perfect business solution had become infinitely more complicated, tangled with emotions neither of them had expected to feel. The question was, would they be brave enough to admit that some things were worth more than business success? And could they find a way to save not just their companies, but also their hearts? The morning after their kiss, Marcus arrived at the office to find Emma's desk cleared and a brief email in his inbox. Taking some personal time. We'll handle merger coordination remotely. No explanation, no timeline for her return. Just empty space where she should have been. For 3 weeks, she managed everything through video calls and emails, maintaining a rigorously professional demeanor that drove Marcus crazy. She'd moved into a hotel, refusing to tell him which one, and dodged his attempts to meet in person. The only proof she was still in New York was her continued presence in merger meetings, virtual, of course, and occasional sightings reported by their mutual acquaintances. The distance was affecting him more than he cared to admit. He found himself distracted during meetings, his eyes drawn to her empty chair. The penthouse felt cavernous without her presence. No scattered notes on the kitchen counter. No sound of her pacing while she took late-night calls. No faint scent of her perfume lingering in the hallways. William Parker wasn't making things easier. He'd begun quietly meeting with board members, suggesting that the merger was moving too fast, that they needed to reconsider the terms. Some were listening. We're losing control of the narrative, Richard Sterling warned during an emergency meeting. The market is starting to notice. If we don't get this under control, I'll handle it, Marcus interrupted, his voice sharp. He ignored the knowing look his father gave him. Will you? Because from where I'm sitting, you're letting personal feelings interfere with business. Again, Marcus's jaw tightened. What's that supposed to mean? It means I've seen how you look at her, Richard said bluntly. This was supposed to be a business arrangement, Marcus. You weren't supposed to fall in love with her. Like you fell in love with Mom? Marcus shot back. Before or after your arranged marriage? Richard's face softened unexpectedly. You never knew, did you? Your mother and I. Our marriage wasn't arranged. We broke off our arranged marriages to be together. Nearly bankrupted both families in the process. But we didn't care. Marcus stared at his father, stunned. What? But you always said, that business comes first? That love is a luxury we can't afford. Richard shook his head. I said those things to protect you, son. Because I saw how much it hurt your mother when people claimed she'd ruined me. That our love had made me weak. She spent years trying to prove herself to everyone. Working twice as hard to show she was more than just the woman who'd seduced me away from a beneficial merger. He leaned forward, his eyes intense. But you know what? Those years we spent rebuilding, fighting together against everyone who said we'd fail, they made us stronger. Your mother was the best business partner I ever had, because we were fighting for something bigger than profits. We were fighting for our love. Marcus felt like the ground was shifting under his feet. Why are you telling me this now? Because you have the same look I had back then. And Emma? The way she looks at you when she thinks no one's watching. It's exactly how your mother used to look at me. Richard stood, straightening his tie. Don't let fear of what others might think stop you from fighting for what matters. I taught you all the wrong lessons, son. It's time you learned the right ones. That conversation haunted Marcus for days. He threw himself into work, trying to distract himself, but Emma's absence was like a physical ache. Every decision, every meeting, felt hollow without her insight, her quiet strength beside him. Then, exactly 1 month after their kiss in the conference room, everything changed. Marcus was in the middle of a board meeting when his assistant burst in. "Sir, you need to see this." The news was already spreading across every financial network. William Parker had called an emergency shareholder meeting. He was attempting to halt the merger, claiming that Sterling Technologies had taken advantage of the Parker Group's vulnerability to orchestrate a hostile takeover. The room erupted in chaos, but Marcus barely heard it. His eyes were fixed on the TV screen where William Parker stood at a podium, Emma nowhere in sight. His phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number with an address in Brooklyn and 3 words that made his heart race. "I need you." He was out of his chair before he'd finished reading, ignoring the shouts behind him. The address led him to a small cafe in Dumbo, the kind of place that would never appear on the radar of Manhattan's business elite. Emma sat at a corner table, looking smaller somehow in jeans and a sweater, her hair falling loose around her shoulders. "Your father's trying to destroy everything we've built," he said without preamble, sliding into the seat across from her. "I know." She looked up, and he was struck by the clarity in her eyes. "That's not why I called you here." "Then why did you—" "Because I finally figured it out." She took a deep breath. "All my life, I've been trying to be what everyone else needed. The perfect daughter, the dedicated executive, the arranged wife. I was so focused on saving my father's legacy that I forgot to build my own." Marcus's heart thundered in his chest. "And what do you want your legacy to be?" "Something real," she said softly. "Something that's mine. I've spent the past month thinking about who I am when I'm not trying to please everyone else. And you know what I realized?" She reached across the table, taking his hand. "I realized that the only time I feel truly myself is when I'm with you." The simple touch of her hand sent electricity through him. "Emma, let me finish," she insisted. "I have a plan. A real one, not just another business strategy. But I need to know if you're willing to risk everything. Because what I'm proposing could cost us both everything we've built." "Tell me." She squeezed his hand. "We let my father halt the merger." "What?" Marcus pulled back, stunned. "Emma, that would be financial suicide. Both companies would have to stand on their own," she finished. "The Parker Group would return to being independent with my father in control. He'd have what he wants, his company back, and Sterling Technologies would be free of any obligation to save us. And you? What do you get out of this?" A slow smile spread across her face. "Freedom. To start my own company, building the things I've always dreamed of but couldn't pursue under my father's shadow. I've already got investors lined up, people who believe in my vision, not just my family name." Marcus's mind raced, seeing the possibilities. "The AI integration project you were working on would be just the beginning," she confirmed. "I've got plans for revolutionizing how consulting works, combining technology with human insight in ways neither of our companies would ever approve. But I can't do it while I'm trying to save my father's company. I need to let go." "Your father will see it as a betrayal." "Maybe," she acknowledged, "but I can't keep sacrificing my dreams to protect his." "And Marcus," her voice softened, "I can't keep pretending this thing between us is just business." He stood abruptly, pulling her up with him. Other customers stared as he cupped her face in his hands. "Say it again." "I love you," she whispered, tears shining in her eyes. Not because of some arrangement, not because it's good for business, but because you see me, really see me, and you make me brave enough to be who I really am. Marcus kissed her then, not caring who saw or what tomorrow's gossip columns would say. When they finally broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers. I love you too, and I'll risk everything, my company, my reputation, all of it, to build something real with you. Emma's laugh was watery but joyful. Even if it means starting over, especially then, he brushed away her tears with his thumbs. Because this time, we'll build something that's truly ours. The next few months were a whirlwind of challenges and changes. As predicted, William Parker successfully halted the merger, though the public battle nearly destroyed both companies. The business world was shocked when Marcus Sterling resigned as CEO of Sterling Technologies, citing personal reasons. But the real surprise came 3 months later, when Marcus and Emma launched their own consulting firm, Sterling Parker Innovations. Their first project, an AI-driven platform that helped struggling small businesses compete in the digital age. The kind of businesses that people like Emma's father had once built from nothing. The press called them crazy. Industry veterans predicted their failure. But together, they built something revolutionary. A company that valued innovation over tradition, compassion over profit margins, and love over duty. 1 year to the day after their arranged marriage began, Marcus and Emma stood in front of their friends and family again. This time, there were no business contracts, no hidden agendas. Just two people who had found love in the most unexpected place, exchanging vows they had written themselves. I thought I knew everything about success, Marcus said, holding Emma's hands at the altar. But you taught me that the greatest achievement isn't building a fortune. It's finding someone who makes you want to be better than you are. Emma's eyes shone as she replied, and you taught me that sometimes the best plans are the ones we never made. That love isn't a business risk. It's the greatest investment we can make. As they sealed their real marriage with a kiss, both knew they had found something far more valuable than any merger could have provided. They had found truth in what began as deception, strength in what started as obligation, and most importantly, they had found themselves in each other. The morning after the wedding, they stood together in their new office, watching the sunrise over Brooklyn. The space was smaller than their old corner offices, the furniture less expensive, but it was theirs, built on love, trust, and shared dreams rather than duty and arrangement. Ready to change the world? Emma asked, leaning into his embrace. Marcus kissed her temple, marveling at how perfectly she fit against him. With you, I'm ready for anything. And so began their greatest venture, not a business empire built on power and control, but a life built on love, understanding, and the courage to choose happiness over expectation. They had learned that sometimes the most precious things in life come not from careful planning, but from the beautiful chaos of letting your heart lead the way.